Welcome to FO Live. With me is Gary Grappo, a retired US ambassador, a noted American diplomat, and of course, Glenn Carle, a retired CIA officer and the author of The Interrogator and a senior partner at FOI. And today's discussion is on Israel. Israel squeezes Gaza and attacks Hamas in Qatar. What next? So, without further ado, Gary, you were ambassador in Oman. You were number 2 to Tony Blair. You were running the office of the special envoy of the Peace Quartet in Jerusalem. So you get to go first. What exactly is going on and why do we bother? Why is it such a big deal?
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to join you, Atul, and certainly to be with our colleague Glenn. The first, my first reaction upon hearing the news of Israel's attack on the Hamas officials in Doha, Qatar, was that that's the end of negotiations, at least for the foreseeable future. Number one, I can't anticipate that Qatar, unless they come under U.S. pressure to remain active, will feel any interest or obligation to pursue its role as one of the principal negotiators in the effort to find some kind of a resolution to the war between Israel and Hamas. That, for the time being, I think remains so. Everything I've read since then bolsters that conclusion that I drew within the first few moments.
So, sorry to interrupt. Could you just explain to our listeners and our viewers what exactly happened? What did Israel do? Why is that such a big deal?
2 days ago, Israel launched a very bold attack using its fighter aircraft launched from Israel upon Doha and targeting the building that Hamas officials use for carrying out their business around the world, to the extent that they have operations elsewhere, which we all know that they do. Their leadership is based there, and they obviously have a support staff. That area may also host some of the housing for the authorities there. I'm not so sure of that, but nevertheless, this very bold attack intending to kill the senior leadership, external leadership, and that's important, and we can come back to that, of Hamas there in Doha. All indications are so far that they probably failed to take out the 3 most senior leaders they had been targeting, and instead killed others, including apparently one Qatari security official. I don't know whether he was inside the facility. He may have been assigned outside to provide external security. And so one can understand the immediate reaction of the Qatari government and criticizing this attack in a very, very strong language, and now further enhanced because of the loss of a Qatari citizen. And so, as I said, the negotiations are effectively at a standstill. And the conclusion based on that is, one that really has to ask is, does Prime Minister Netanyahu have any interest at all now in any kind of a ceasefire and returning the hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza back to Israel? There's a real question out there, and a lot of people they were always asking it, and now I think we'll hear more of that as time progresses. One final comment I will say is that when it became apparent that Israel had failed to eliminate these senior officials they've been targeting, I think it was the Israeli ambassador in Washington, was in a very frank and transparent moment said, we'll do it again, whether it'll be in Doha or elsewhere. The real question is, I think, A, the future of the negotiations, and B, whether Qatar will continue to host Hamas. And I'm sure they're wrestling with that very decision now.
So this begs the question whether the Israelis were negotiating in good faith, if they were planning to take out the negotiators representing Hamas. Then that begs the question, number one, whether they were negotiating in good faith, and number two, they've attacked a U.S. ally and violated the sovereignty of a U.S. ally. So did they just willy-nilly ignore U.S. sensibilities, or did they actually have some kind of tacit, if not overt, green signal from the White House?
Well, that's another question. The White House, on fairly short notice, came out with a statement and was very critical of the attack, pointing out that Hamas was playing an important role in the negotiations, and moreover, it's an important ally of the United States in the region, and therefore this was unacceptable. Now, I've heard stronger language used when an ally of the United States carries out an action we oppose. But nevertheless, it does raise the question, did the United States really object to this? Apparently, they were notified, but only shortly before the Israelis launched this attack. And so it's unclear what the White House position really was, although they have said that they oppose it. But there are questions in my mind, and I'm certain in the minds of many, many others, whether the United States had really opposed this, particularly when we know for a fact that Trump had earlier told Bibi Netanyahu to do whatever he had to do to end this. So you have to worry about the bona fides of the United States in these negotiations, too.
Glenn, over to you. What are your thoughts on the matter? I'm sure you have many.
I don't know that I have many. I do know that the attack occurred very near to where I stayed in Qatar, and it's right in the center of the town. And of course, war has come to the center of major cities in the Middle East, everywhere else. But even years removed from having been there, it is a shock how brazen and bold the Israeli action was this time. I think that perhaps not only are negotiations stopped or just will trail off, for an indeterminate future without doing anything, but that I've come to accept what I had thought before was an outlandish assessment about what the Israeli government is doing, which meaning that Netanyahu does seem, the war in Gaza does seem to be his actions so that he can maintain power and avoid prosecution in jail. The Israeli military, Israeli intelligence services, all by multiple accounts have urged restraint, a ceasefire, stopping, that there are no meaningful objectives to achieve still, or that are achievable short of possibly literally genocide. And yet there's no indication that things will go on. So that negotiations will continue, so the war will just go on. I think that it's a signal, the attack is a signal that Netanyahu has decided the way to victory is to completely destroy Hamas. And that would be, I think, correct if it were, and it's always been correct. If we can eliminate Hamas, then we don't have Hamas as a problem anymore. But even in Hamas's weak state and with the destruction of Gaza, I don't know that, as we all have said many times, that a conventional military series of actions can address a philosophical, theological, cultural perspective and yearning, however manifest by 2 million people. So I think it means an endless war at some relatively low level, because I don't think that the Netanyahu has decided we will expel all 2 million Gazans and occupy Gaza and make it part of Greater Israel. as his most important supporters and advisors would like. But this series of piecemeal actions, a step forward, half a step back, a step sideways, a step forward, militarily towards Hamas, and then affecting the Palestinians, it all amounts to progressively, de facto, the same thing, which is that the endpoint can plausibly now be seen of the Palestinians actually being removed from Gaza. So as not, otherwise they will die. That's not tomorrow or next month. But what other direction can this go other than a ceasefire if the war continues? So I think that this is a signal of a decision that sort of organically emerged in Israeli policy, or rather than from a grand strategy. But that seems to be the how it's adding up in the direction it's going, and all because for all of the ill ease that the Trump administration has expressed, and I think sincerely, about the attack in Doha by Israel from the get-go, from January 20 of this administration of this year, and before, the Trump has given carte blanche to Benjamin Netanyahu, which means mostly to the far right of the Israeli political process. We've seen less dramatic, but nonetheless really important examples of this in the West Bank, which no one's talking about whatsoever. I think Gary will know probably this better than I, but I recall that it's something like 86% of the territory of the West Bank is now controlled by, seized by, settled on by Israelis, the Israeli government. And so what two-state solution can there be with a Gaza, which is now an enclave, not even Gaza itself, and the West Bank, which is 14% of what we all imagine the West Bank territory is? And it's of a piece with the attack in Doha. It's moving in a really dramatic, apocalyptic direction. Ultimately, I don't know that it can reach that endpoint, but that's the only policy that Netanyahu seems to have, so that he can avoid going to jail.
So let me tell you what some other commentators are saying. The Rest is Politics is the leading podcast in the UK. And Alistair Campbell, who was the spin doctor for Tony Blair, and Rory Stewart, who's ex-MI6, although he denies it. And he was an MP, he ran to be Prime Minister, and he's Tory, and Alistair is Labour. And both of them said that this was absolutely catastrophic. The attack in Qatar, it violated a US ally's sovereignty, and Qatar had bought billions of dollars of US arms. Qatar had even bought a plane or given a plane to Donald Trump. Qatar has invested in the US as well. And all of that has counted for zilch, for nothing. So no amount of investment in the US, no amount of buying US arms, no amount of placating the great gods who sit on Capitol Hill and in the White House saves you from l'enfant terrible, the younger brother Israel, in the Middle East. And so this sends a very bad signal, and this sets a precedent, as in if there are Hamas leaders or whom Israel deems Hamas leaders, remember that they have not been tried, they have not been taken to court, it's just a process of liquidation. If they are in London, does that mean that Bibi Netanyahu will strike London? Will he strike Geneva? Will he strike Washington, D.C. and New York? So the questions that people are raising after this attack are manifold. And the implications that follow on, both externally and internally. Internally, a lot of people do not support this attack. They think that it may be better to negotiate and get the hostages out. They think that Ben Gvir and Smotrich are nutters. These are words of Joseph Olmert, Ehud Olmert's younger brother, who interviews with us regularly. These are not my words. And so there is a lot of disquiet about Bibi Netanyahu. And there's also suspicion that the attack was timed precisely on the day, maybe to the hour, to his court hearing about corruption. So, Gary, you know Israel really well. Unpack this all for us.
I think it's really important, first of all, to state that the lines dividing the pro versus anti-Netanyahu groups have been drawn very clearly for quite some time. There's no one crossing from one side to the other. That's not to say that someone on the far right couldn't be so appalled by a particular action, the Bibi, that they would move to the other side. And then there's, of course, a large contingent of Israelis somewhere in the very broad middle. And that's the problem that the state of Israel faces today. It's a very divided nation, not unlike at all the United States right now.
Yeah.
And
Charlie Kirk was shot dead yesterday.
Yes, he was, and we're seeing the predictable lines drawn when it comes to commentary about that. However, with respect to Netanyahu and Israel, without question, Bibi Netanyahu has been one of the most clever and astute politicians in the world, and you have to give him his due for that.
He's the longest-serving Israeli prime minister in a system with proportional representation, fractious politics, yes, and unstable governance, relatively unstable governance.
He is a masterful builder of coalitions, and 20 years ago, a coalition like the one he currently has would never have been even considered, much less attempted and assembled. But he did it because he felt it was in his interest to do so, i.e., if he was going to win the necessary majority in the Knesset to win the prime minister position. And I think it's fair to say that he will probably do almost anything to keep that coalition intact. Now, he may lose one or two, and he has briefly previously, but they all more or less come back home simply because the far right wing of that coalition really has nowhere else to go if they want any say whatsoever in the future of Israel. Otherwise, they would be completely cut out, even by Likud, which is not as far right as some of the other parties. For example, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. So this is a very divided country, and it's reflected clearly in their politics and in how they perceive this war. I think what is most interesting to note, and Glenn has pointed this out, and that is for the most part, the leadership of the IDF and the intelligence services, and I include former leaders of both of those organizations, are all pretty unanimously critical of what Bibi is doing in the war in Gaza. And yet he persists, and he's keeping his coalition together. Now, in defense of Bibi, I will simply say that if he wants to root out Hamas, root and branch, as he asserts he wants to do, and you assume that may be possible, then it's logical to assume he's going to go after the senior Hamas leadership wherever they may be, including in a place like Doha. And without someone like Donald Trump and the United States saying, no, that's a line you may not cross, we can expect him to do it. And he will continue to do it unless Trump and the U.S. make it clear that you may never try this again. And to your point, Atul, about could he do this elsewhere? Absolutely. They would do it if it was viewed to be in their interest, but they would do it differently. There are far more subtle ways of taking out your opposition or your enemies without sending F-35s and F-16s to basically turn their facilities into a deep hole.
The Russians have demonstrated that in the UK.
The Russians they lack some of the savoir-faire. I would think of the Israelis and others as well, but the Israelis have the ability to go after their enemies. They've proven that time and time again, and they won't hesitate to do it. As I said, by other means. What this portends for the future of Israel is really unclear, because Glenn is right. Israel is engaged in a forever war. There will always be Hamas fighters, or people willing to fight for the cause of Hamas. That's not going to stop, regardless of how many leaders they take out. And secondly, and this is important to point out, is that Hamas today is not the organization that it was 2 years ago. It was a very centralized organization, well coordinated, with pretty effective communication from the top down to the various commanders and sub-lieutenants and so forth. Today, it's very decentralized. Going after the leadership, underscoring the external leadership in Doha, may not have much of an effect of Hamas in Gaza itself. They may dance to their own music there. Number one, because it's a different leadership, and number two, because it's a very decentralized organization now. The individual Gazan commanders throughout Gaza are, for the most part, making the decisions, organizing their troops, carrying out actions with very little direction from Hamas Central in Gaza itself. And so I don't think we'll see much of an impact on Hamas's fighting capability and its leadership in Gaza itself.
So is it just optics then? Is it just a diversion from his legal troubles, this attack? Or is there real conviction going on that Bibi and his far-right allies believe they have to go and kill everybody, and it's vendetta? It's like a Sicilian vendetta.
All of the above. This is a point that I make frequently. Usually it's observers of American politics asking, well, what is the plan? What's the strategy? Or here is the strategy that I perceive. And usually both of those approaches are wrong, because any government, and we know the Israeli one in this circumstance right now, and the United States throughout all of our careers and everywhere else, it's also true, is not a unified entity, and it will at best pursue multiple simultaneously contradictory objectives, and whichever works first and more becomes the policy that one claims to have pursued. So Netanyahu would be happy to kill all of the Hamas leaders and destroy Hamas, and every strike moves the ball a little in that direction. At the same time, long term, it probably makes things worse, because the bench, all of a sudden has more recruits. And to the extent that negotiation would work, that's also pursued without necessarily being believed in at all. So I don't think we should look for too much coherent strategic unity in what's happening. And I've concluded that, shockingly, he is so cynical, Netanyahu, that pursuing a war to almost no point, except the consequence of reducing to misery 2 million people and killing progressive numbers of them, is the consequence. But it does not seem to matter, because it serves his purpose of staying in office and frittering away at Hamas. And I think this is all happening in a framework that I touched upon when Trump came back to office, and I assessed for a different magazine, what does this imply? And the title of my piece was "The World Will Become Nastier and More Brutal." And it wasn't just a jab at Trump. since he's given carte blanche to Netanyahu in the Middle East, largely, and has no interest at all in even attempting to affirm the always halting but nonetheless real normative order, since the United States is stepping away from playing the role of international policeman, which is a really good thing. Without a policeman, you have no one can enforce the laws, and no one will, and thus actually the world becomes more Hobbesian. It becomes more nasty and more brutal, because if someone wants to do something, they can do it without any consequence, and unless there's an entity capable of imposing some sort of order. And that's what's happened in Ukraine. That's what's happening in the South China Sea. Not that the United States necessarily could or can do much about that. And that's what's happening in the Middle East. And it makes it easy for Netanyahu to blow up a building in Doha because he can. I will say on the issue of Qatar, though, Qatar it's infuriating to have your sovereignty infringed this way and so on, but Qatar is in no danger. Israel has no interest in Qatar really whatsoever. If Qatar were all of a sudden trying to attack Israel, that would be a different matter. But no, this was an attack, as Gary said, against Hamas in Qatar. And if there's a Hamas official in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, he'll drink poison tea some morning. So that's how that is playing out.
How very edifying. Anyway, importantly, there are 2 million Gazans, and there are many more in West Bank. Are we going to see ethnic cleansing in a way the Azerbaijanis have managed in Nagorno-Karabakh? Is that the long game? Make life so unbearable that ultimately Egypt takes the Gazans and Jordan takes the West Bank people. After all, Jordan is majority Palestinian.
It's the explicit objective of the right wing of the Israeli political spectrum, the religious right. It's their explicit objective. And it's progressively the de facto reality. Each day is they starve more, constrain more, and have a choice of living somewhere else or die. Many will choose to die, and many will choose to live. I still believe it's not the explicit, conscious objective of the Netanyahu administration, but little steps of incoherent nature day to day add up to a coherent narrative of the end of Palestinians in Gaza progressively.
Yeah, I think you have to ask the question, I know I do, that if Israel creates the conditions that make life simply unsustainable, is that tantamount to relocation? Because ultimately, Gazans are going to feel it necessary to go, to leave, to flee, and the pressure is
Will
going.
Egypt open the Rafah crossing?
And it is interesting because there have been reports that Egypt has begun building some camps, not nearly enough to take all the Gazans, but has been building some camps. But at some point, you have to ask the question, if Gazans simply reached a point of absolute intolerance and could not remain longer in Gaza, they flee en masse across the border. And Egypt is unable to prevent them, and Israel makes no effort to stop them. What then? And now you'll still have some smattering of Gazans left, but you'll have substantial numbers that will successfully flee Gaza. And then what? The fear of everyone in the Middle East is that's it. They'll never be able to return to Gaza again, despite whatever pressure the rest of the world, including the United States, may put on Israel to readmit them.
So Nakba 2.0.
Pardon?
Nakba 2.0. The first
Yeah.
Nakba in 1948, and this is another Nakba.
But far differently, carried out far differently, because not everyone who fled during the Nakba was forced to flee. Some chose to flee and were encouraged by other Arab countries, which is something not very well known. Arab countries encouraged many Palestinians to flee, thinking that the Arabs would defeat Israel in the 48 war. Be that as it may, those kind of
just so
lines.
that our viewers and listeners know, Nakba is the flight
Yes.
of Palestinians in 1948 when they fled. They see it as a catastrophe, and they see it as part of Israel's plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the Holy Land. The reality, as Gary explained, is a little more complex, but still, yes, a lot of Palestinians lost their homes and became refugees.
Yes, and so, but in the case of Gaza, what happens there, it would be very apparent, and in that case, Israel would most definitely be accused, whether they had the express purpose of expelling them or not, of creating the conditions so repellent and inhospitable that it gave Gazans no choice if they wanted to live, but to flee Gaza. Now, having said all this, I really want to point out, because it's something that the international community, by the way, it hasn't just been Britain and France and a few other countries who've criticized the Israeli action against Hamas in Doha. The world is almost unanimous in condemning that action. Unanimous. Mm-hmm. And the Gulf countries were particularly vocal, which initially led me to believe and to wonder whether pressure had been brought on the Trump administration by a country like Saudi Arabia. You have to condemn this. We insist. And Saudi Arabia carries a lot of weight in the White House these days. Mm-hmm. I don't know this for a fact.
And people should remember that the Saudis are not great fans of the Qataris. The Al Sauds and the Al Thanis, shall we say, don't exactly have a love fest going on. And Saudi Arabia and UAE blocked Qatar, and Qatar had to get a lot of its supplies from Iran. So there are tensions between these countries. And yet, because of the attack, because of the precedent it sets, and because of the fears it evokes, they've all lined up against Israel when it comes to this incident.
Oh, absolutely. So there's been universal condemnation around the world for this action, particularly by the Gulf countries and other Arab countries. But inside Israel, the situation is very different. For the most part, Bibi's policy with respect to going after Hamas enjoys pretty strong support, as many as 70%. And I mean, this is astonishing. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I think a lot has to do with the continuing angst and trauma stemming from the October 7th attack against the Israeli civilians in Israel itself, that horrendous attack. That's a significant part of it. And I think many Israelis have resigned themselves to embracing the idea that the only way that they're going to end this threat is to completely eliminate Hamas. As difficult, I would say impossible as that may be. And so support for the war against Hamas still remains pretty strong in Israel, even though a majority of Israelis want to see a release of the hostages. So there's a bit of straddling of the fence, so to speak, in terms of Israeli politics, supporting Bibi's policy against Hamas, but wanting an immediate release of the hostages being kept by Hamas, which of course is not going to happen unless Israel accepts a ceasefire, which they initially had, and Hamas turned it down.
So here's a question. Hamas wants a ceasefire, supposedly, or at least it claims it does. And yet it has no qualms in having the image of a emaciated prisoner digging his own grave, or at least that is what appears in an image, evoking memories of the Holocaust. What is going on? Why is there such extraordinary hostility on both sides?
Well, this is a really important point to me, which has largely been buried in the rubble of Gaza now and makes it impossible to talk about. And that is, one needs to have some sympathy, I would say, understanding at least, of the Israeli position. And I think that then explains, one can then understand why 70% or more of Israelis, which is a big change since prior to Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023, now support the war, broadly speaking, or attacking or destroying Hamas and so on, whereas before a strong majority were not just against Netanyahu, but were against that policy even, and were in favor of a two-state solution, which now is less supported. Why? Because, and here's where Hamas gets off the hook because of the rubble in Gaza. Hamas is unrepentant, unchanged. They do swear the destruction of Israel and the elimination of every Jew from the river to the sea, and they are quite sincere in it. And even after all of their supposed ceasefire proposals, they've all been partial expedients to stop the bombs from falling, but don't address any of the fundamental issues of the war and why Israel feels that it has no choice but to destroy Hamas. And one can understand that position. If we stop, they are unchanged and they will continue and attack us again. So the only way we have out is either to lose or to win, to be destroyed ourselves slowly or to destroy those who are trying to kill us all. And there may only be a few thousand, several hundred cadre in Hamas, but it only takes one person to do horrible things and to lead many others to do horrible things. And that is the truth. Hamas bears responsibility not just for the beginning of this war, but to a substantial degree also for its continuation, because despite everything, they have changed nothing in their positions. And if you were an Israeli leader, if I were an Israeli leader, I could not accept that. So what do I do? The most likely thing is yet another partial solution, which pushes the problem to an unforeseeable but predictable date in the future. Or you say, okay, we're going to move 2 million people and we'll kill all the leaders because that's the best thing we can do. It's hideous, it's horrible, or at least horrible, but it's not crazy to take that perspective if you're an Israeli, given that Hamas remains unchanged.
So kill the leaders, move the people. That is the underlying instinct, if not the policy, of the Bibi Netanyahu government because of this paranoia or the fear that Hamas engenders. Because Hamas, as many have pointed out, is an Islamist, a fascist, an extremely intolerant organization. And in a way, the Israeli actions have made it even more fanatical, because if you have your brother dying in the rubble, or your sister or your mother and other family members, your near and dear ones, perish, it makes you more hardline. Either you will completely yield or you would want revenge. So in a way, we are locked in a cycle of revenge.
Well, I think that you underestimate the degree of commitment and hatred in Hamas prior to Israel's attack. I think they're unchanged from 2 years of war. They were happy to slit the throat of the husband and rape the woman in front of him before doing it, and they are still They just are less able to do it now. Most Palestinians, 99 point whatever percent, I don't know, want to be left alone, want their own state, are not themselves committed jihadists, I suppose you could say, against Israel, but thousands of angry young men are.
I would add one other point to that, and that is, and this really became apparent to me during my time serving in the Middle East and dealing with our own set of challenges in those days, and that is the pervasiveness among extremist groups like Hamas of a martyr culture, and that part of the recruitment and certainly part of the training that they go through is the nobility one achieves by becoming a martyr.
There are 72 virgins waiting in afterlife. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I don't think that really enters into it. I know that that's the common perception among some, but no, that I don't think there is an army in the world that recruits its soldiers, its sailors, Marines, airmen, and so forth, and sailors the way that these groups do. That
I mean, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 really triggered this idea of shahadat, of becoming a shaheed, and that has gone from the Shia world to the Sunni world. Of course, it existed in the Sunni world earlier, but
it goes back in Islamic history.
Correct, but it's really more of a Shia tradition. But now it infects everybody pretty much.
It absolutely does. And most especially in all of the extremist groups, whether it's the Islamic State, Hezbollah, Hamas, the various militia groups in Iraq, and others that we've seen come and go. And you can, if you go online, you can look at how they recruit individuals, and they pay a lot of attention to this theme of martyrdom. And that's something that Western states have a very difficult time in comprehending, because once you lose fear, that the fear of death, you become a different type of soldier, very different type. And we've seen this time and time again with suicide bombers and so forth. We're seeing fewer of them because they've become more sophisticated. They've mastered the technology surrounding IEDs and rockets, drones, and what have you. But nevertheless, the mentality and the culture of martyrdom is pervasive among these groups, which means that it's going to be extremely difficult for Israel to achieve its claimed objective of eliminating Hamas. It's I think, a physical impossibility, despite what Bibi may think. And I think there's appreciation on the part of the IDF. This is a physical impossibility. But it doesn't detract from the point that there will be these individuals who are committed to, if not the destruction of the Israeli state, to the killing of Jews. And that's what the Israelis are targeting.
Well, this calls to our attention a dynamic that all countries have to struggle with, but certainly that was shaping American policy during the quote war on terror. And it devolved or evolved into a left-right perception argument, which broadly speaking, this is a very broad brush, but still, in the U.S., the conservatives, the right thought, well, we have a problem and we will destroy it, and that will eliminate the problem. So let's go kill the leadership of Al Qaeda, break it up, and then we can all, go to the casino. And we found that by killing one, not that Mubarak was completely right saying 100 more terrorists came up, but that others would surface because they had been inspired by the martyr that we had killed. And there's nothing more powerful than a religious conviction. And it doesn't even have to be a theological, religious kind of faith in some series of beliefs, because people will die for that. A large number of the Jesuit priests in the 17th century went into the Americas. I'm thinking specifically of the French, but the Spanish also, knowing that they had a real possibility of being skinned alive, and many were, but they went anyway because that was the higher, more noble calling, and they were willing to martyr themselves for their beliefs, and so are these call them jihadists. So when that doesn't work, if you can't destroy a discrete entity and achieve your objectives, what do you do? Well, what we did was for 20 years, we repeated the same thing with ever increasing technological, tweaks. But the more astute approach, but one unacceptable for someone who deals in a 1 year or 4 year time frame and is unwilling to accept a 20 or 60 year time frame, is you have to try to change the rules of the game and the lay of the land. And that would imply, in this context, not only going after Hamas, but trying to provide a different way for the Palestinians and Hamas members to see the world and to think, which implies some sort of a solution, imperfect from an Israeli perspective, but that gives some way forward that changes the paradigm of beliefs for 2 million Palestinians at least. And that then slowly would reduce the number of people who were inspired to go off and sacrifice their lives while trying to make a point in killing a dirty Jew. But that's not acceptable generally to political figures, particularly those on the right who think, well, we will impose our will and solve the problem.
Now, you told me a story, or I believe it was either you or someone else as well, that back in the day, Mossad married off 20 of the most dreaded Hezbollah commanders. And all of these guys who were deadly became respectable fathers, taking their kids to school and in the words of the Brits, enjoying top-level shagging at night. And recidivism was zero. And you've said many a time, and I concur, that testosterone is the biggest problem for the world. Young men, especially single young men, tend to be violent. And so are you suggesting honey traps for all the top Hamas leaders and an economic path to prosperity, potentially in the next 20 years for the other Palestinians in Gaza and in West Bank?
Well, there are two sides to the coin here, or to the issue. Yes, and this is just the American position put in different terms, or what has been really the Western position about the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian Israeli problem for 70 years. It's a two-state solution, really, and that's harder to imagine now than ever. But you want to do two things. You have to give some future, some hope, and some present reality that is hopeful to Palestinians, other than a reality other than I feel constrained, I feel subjugated, and I can't step where I want to step, literally. And at the same time, you have to do the other part I touched upon before, which is to convince Hamas, or its devout, to repudiate, or at least to walk away from their defining characteristic, which is that we will kill the Jews and reoccupy our land. There's nothing new in that solution. And it's easy to state, and obviously has been impossible to achieve. But unless you offer hope to the other side, this will be endless. And that's a lesson that any negotiator, really, whether you're dealing with a jihadist or a trade negotiation, which I used to do too, it doesn't matter what the subject is. You always want to have the person across the table from you have an incentive to say yes. There has to be something in it for him other than subjugation or destruction.
But has the ship already sailed? Because as you yourself said, 14% of the land is now in Palestinian hands in West Bank. And in Gaza, life is pretty dire. You're being struck willy-nilly by the Israeli military. You do not have enough food, leave aside water. I dread to think what the sanitation is like. So has now the ship sailed? Is the die now cast? Are we basically just waiting for the Egyptians to let the Gazans in and for the Jordanians to let the Palestinians from the West Bank in?
I can't imagine a circumstance in which King Abdullah in Jordan would allow the Palestinians of the West Bank to move into Jordan. It's just it's incomprehensible. There is challenge enough in Jordan today, given the current demographic lineup. And
what is the percentage of Palestinians in Jordan? 70%?
Various estimates, I would say 60% is the lowest. I've heard as high as 75% of Palestinians. Now, these are Palestinians who settled in Jordan after 48, so they probably feel more Jordanian. In fact, I'm sure they do today, and certainly their successors do. Gaza is a different story. And I find it hard to believe that the Egyptians, for a variety of reasons, certainly economic but also political, would want to host 2,000 Palestinians going forward. They see the problems that Jordan has had to deal with, although the disproportionality.
2 million Palestinians, I believe, not 2,000.
I'm sorry, 2 million. The disproportionality that we see in Jordan would not appear in Egypt, but nevertheless, it would exacerbate the various problems related to their economy.
The Muslim Brotherhood would become a lot stronger.
All of that.
In
the Egyptians wanted Palestinians.
Yeah, what has happened? They have seen what has happened in history when Palestinians are permitted to settle somewhere. And the classic case was Lebanon after a Black September and the expulsion of the Palestinians from Jordan to Lebanon, and then the eruption in 1979 of the I'm getting my dates off a little bit here, but around 1980, 1979, the explosion of the Lebanese civil war. And so I do not anticipate that either of these countries would be willing to play host to large numbers of Palestinians. And as much as the Israelis and even maybe the Europeans and the Americans would want to see it, I think they dig in their heels. And so it can't happen. But I would think that the Israelis they really don't have a very clear image of what an Israeli occupation of Gaza would really mean today, because it would dramatically alter Israel's relations with virtually every country in the world. Every country in the world. They would become pariahs if they realize it today or not. And even more so if there was an attempt to annex even a part of the West Bank. Despite what the right wing and Bibi's coalition may want or believe. And so there are some real impediments for Israel doing this, despite this mirage or chimera that many Israelis continue to hold, that if we had the West Bank and Gaza, this problem would go away. No, it wouldn't. That problem would remain, and a whole host of new problems would be created for the state of Israel. I will also say that the American public is growing increasingly impatient and frustrated with our support, continuing support for the state of Israel.
And very quickly to jump in, this is happening both on the right and the left. It's not
Exactly.
just on the left.
And
People
it's
like
most apparent.
Bannon have come out and said, come on, this is enough.
Exactly. And it's most apparent in younger Americans who don't remember the 48 war or the 67 and 73 wars or anything else before, say, 2000. And now wonder why it is that the United States is willing to stand foursquare against anyone who opposes Israel, regardless of the drain on resources that it is for the United States. And I think we will see an increasing decline of support for Israel by the American people. And that will certainly bleed over into the Congress. And the day will come when Congress will approve a resolution blocking further military aid. Well, I may not see it in my lifetime, but it's coming. It's coming.
By the way, it's interesting you should say that. A retired MI6 officer once quipped, half in jest, of course, that Israel is a modern-day crusader state, and that state lasted a while too. And once the Arabs find their modern-day Saladin, or by the way, Saladin was Kurdish, then Israel's goose is cooked. And this is increasingly a sentiment I hear from some Israelis themselves, that they worry about civil war in Israel, something to discuss next time. And they also worry about the viability of Israel in the long term. They think Bibi Netanyahu is being tactically brilliant but strategically stupid.
Well, a lot of not that I know, many Israelis, but the Israelis I know, and those I know, this following fact is shocking given their position in society, have multiple passports because they are hedging their bets. And they don't, they fear that the experiment is going awry, and they don't want to be caught with nowhere to go. I was shocked, actually, at that. But, the demographic, independent of all things you talked about, the demographic trends in Israel itself, the changed and changing nature of the Jewish Israeli population, given immigration, recent decades of immigration patterns, and thus the changing nature of the perspective on what Israel should be and how democracy or should function, or if there should be a democracy. All those things have changed in ways that alarm the largely secular West European Jewish population and perspective that is mine from New England.
On that somber note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this FO Live. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please make sure you sign up for our newsletters on our website. We will be back to discuss more, and this time we will focus on Israel itself, the internal dynamics of Israel, Israeli democracy over the years, and the future direction of Israeli society. Thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.